There are moments in a criminal investigation that redefine everything that came before them. Not the dramatic moments that make for good television. Not the sirens, not the perimeter tape, not the press conferences standing in front of microphones. The real turning points are quieter than that. They happen in rooms most people never see. They happen on computer screens in the middle of the night when a technician notices something that shouldn't be there, something that was supposed to be gone, something that was deliberately destroyed but somehow survived. Those are the moments that change cases. Those are the moments that change lives. In the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, one of those moments may have just arrived. And the questions it raises are not simple ones. Because new footage doesn't just give investigators something to look at. It gives investigators something to think about. It gives the public something to question. And in a case this complicated, with this many moving pieces and this many unanswered questions, new footage doesn't always bring clarity. Sometimes, it brings an entirely new set of mysteries. So today we are going to do something different. We are not going to simply describe what the footage shows. We are going to ask what it really shows. We are going to ask what it means, what it suggests, what it leaves open, and why investigators are still, after all this time, without an arrest. Because if you have been following this case, you know that the footage is only part of the story. The bigger story is everything that surrounds it. Let's begin at the beginning, because the beginning of this story is actually the end of something. The end of what investigators thought they knew. When Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home in the early morning hours of February, the initial picture seemed devastating in its simplicity. An elderly woman, taken from her home in the middle of the night. A doorbell camera that had been deliberately disabled by whoever entered that property. And footage that, by all accounts, was gone forever. The device had been cut offline at 1:47 in the morning. The manufacturer confirmed what investigators feared. The data was corrupted, the images were unrecoverable, and without a paid subscription to cloud storage services, there was no backup waiting somewhere on a server. The first days of the investigation moved forward on almost nothing. Still images of a masked figure, a shape without a face, a presence without a name. For 2 weeks, that was the reality. Law enforcement worked with what little they had. The silhouette of a person. The outline of a backpack. The shadow of someone who had come and gone and left almost no trace of themselves behind. Almost. Because the person who disconnected that camera made a mistake that would ultimately define this entire investigation. They understood enough about security cameras to know the device needed to be disabled. They did not understand enough about modern technology to know that disabling the device was not the same as deleting the evidence. In the world of digital forensics, there is a concept that investigators rely on more often than most people realize. It is called residual data. It refers to the information that remains on servers, on hard drives, in back-end systems, even after it has been marked for deletion, even after the surface has been wiped clean. Residual data is the digital equivalent of a fingerprint that the human eye cannot see but that ultraviolet light reveals in an instant. The Nest camera at Nancy Guthrie's home had been transmitting footage, even briefly, even in fragments, to Google's back-end servers before the plug was pulled. Older Nest models are designed to store clips of several minutes for a few hours on the cloud, even without a subscription. Newer models store shorter clips for slightly longer windows. Either way, some data had been transmitted before the disconnection. Data that was not gone. Data that was simply waiting for someone with the right legal authority and the right technical expertise to find it. The FBI served a search warrant to Google. 8 days after Nancy's disappearance, on February 10th, investigators announced that they had recovered additional footage from residual data located in back-end systems. And what that footage showed changed the entire shape of the investigation. The footage that emerged was grainy but undeniable. A male figure, moving slowly and deliberately toward the front door of Nancy Guthrie's home. Head bent low. Movements careful and precise. Everything about the way this person carried themselves suggested not a random act of opportunity, but a calculated act of planning. He approaches the camera as if he knows exactly where it is. He reaches up with a gloved hand and tampers with the device. Then, in one of the most chilling details in the entire video, he reaches down, grabs brush from the front yard, and uses the plants to block the lens. At one point, he stares directly into the camera, holding the vegetation he has just ripped from the ground. It is a gaze that investigators have analyzed frame by frame, looking for anything, any detail, any feature beneath the mask that might identify who this person is. The footage also revealed that the suspect was carrying what appeared to be a handgun in a front holster. This single detail fundamentally transformed the threat assessment of the case. Investigators were no longer simply searching for someone who had taken an elderly woman. They were searching for someone armed, someone prepared for resistance, someone who had come to that property equipped for whatever they expected to encounter. The implications of that are not comfortable to sit with. The physical description that emerged from the analysis was specific enough to be actionable. A male, approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall. Average build. Dark backpack identified as a 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack, the kind sold at Walmart locations across the country. Investigators moved quickly on that detail, contacting Walmart to request purchase records for that specific model. It is the kind of lead that sounds promising in a press conference and proves enormously complicated in practice, given how many of those backpacks are sold every single day. The day the footage was released, the tip line exploded. Nearly 5,000 calls came in within hours. The total would eventually climb toward 40,000, each one requiring attention, each one requiring evaluation, each one representing either the breakthrough the investigation desperately needed or another thread that would lead nowhere. And here is where the questions begin. Because the new footage that has emerged, the footage sparking fresh questions right now, does not simply confirm what investigators already knew. It complicates it. Law enforcement sources have disclosed something that changes the timeline in ways that are not yet fully understood. Analysts now believe that the suspect may have approached the front door of Nancy Guthrie's home not once, but twice on the night she disappeared. Read that again. Not once. Twice. The first approach, according to this analysis, may have occurred before the second one captured on the original footage. During this potential first visit, the suspect may have noticed that the camera was still active, registered that he was being recorded, and retreated, only to return later, this time prepared, this time equipped to deal with the device. The images that suggest this first approach show the figure without the backpack and without the gun holster that are visible in the later footage. The photographs are not time-stamped, and investigators have been careful to state that any suggestion the images were taken on different days entirely remains speculative. But the possibility is there, and it is significant. If this interpretation is correct, what we are looking at is not a crime of impulse or even simple premeditation. What we are looking at is a suspect who arrived at this property, assessed the situation in real time, identified a problem, withdrew, adjusted his plan, and returned to execute it. That is not the behavior of someone acting recklessly. That is the behavior of someone trained in the kind of patient, methodical thinking that most people associate with professional operations. Former FBI Special Agent Jason Pack described this interpretation in stark terms. The fact that there was preparation and planning, he noted, makes this a more sophisticated type of criminal activity than someone simply showing up. The gap between a first and second approach, if confirmed, would explain something investigators had already suspected but could not previously prove: that this person had conducted surveillance of Nancy Guthrie's home well before the night she was taken. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has asked neighbors in a roughly 2-square-mile radius around the Guthrie residence to check their home security systems for footage dating all the way back to January 1st, a full month before the abduction. They are looking for vehicles, for pedestrians who appeared to loiter, for any sign of someone watching and waiting and learning the rhythms of that home before they acted. That request, which might have seemed precautionary at the time, now reads like something much more purposeful. The footage exists within a broader constellation of evidence that the investigation has assembled over the past several weeks, and understanding the footage requires understanding everything around it. Because no single piece of evidence in this case stands alone. Every detail connects to something else. The doorbell video led investigators to focus on the gloves the suspect was wearing. A pair of gloves found approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, in a field near the side of the road, appeared to match those visible in the footage. The FBI collected approximately 16 gloves from various locations near the property during the search, most of them discarded by members of the public who had joined the search effort. But one was different. One appeared to match. And that one glove contained DNA. The DNA from that glove was sent to a private laboratory in Florida for analysis. On February 14th, preliminary results came back. An unknown male profile had been developed. The profile was submitted to CODIS, the FBI's national database of DNA from convicted offenders and arrestees. The investigation held its breath. And then the results came back with no match. The unknown male whose DNA was on that glove is not in the federal system. He has never been arrested or convicted in any jurisdiction that uploads to the national database. He is, in the most critical sense, unknown. Not just to investigators. Unknown in the system entirely. Sheriff Chris Nanos delivered the news with the careful composure of someone who has learned that investigations require patience that the public does not always have. "We're hopeful," he said, "that we're always getting closer." The words carried the weight of someone who understood exactly how much further there still was to go. But the DNA story does not end there. And this is one of the details that the new footage analysis brings sharply back into focus. The DNA found on the glove is different from unknown DNA that was also found inside Nancy Guthrie's home. 2 separate, unknown profiles. 2 potential contributors. Investigators are now working to determine whether these profiles belong to the same individual who left DNA in 2 separate locations, or whether they represent 2 separate people with some connection to this crime. The implications of that second possibility are ones that investigators are not ready to discuss publicly. But the footage, particularly the potential two-approach theory, raises a question that hangs over the entire investigation. Was there one person at that door, or were there others involved in the planning and execution of this operation that the cameras never captured? The pacemaker data that investigators recovered from Nancy Guthrie's medical device adds a layer of human reality to the technical evidence that is difficult to process. That small device, implanted to regulate her heartbeat, was transmitting data up until 2:28 in the morning on the night she disappeared. The camera was disconnected at 1:47. Motion was detected at 2:12. The pacemaker went silent at 2:28. Within that 41-minute window, everything happened. But the pacemaker told investigators something beyond a timeline. It told them that Nancy was awake when the camera was disconnected. Her heart rate at the moment of the disconnection showed the kind of elevation associated with sudden waking, with fear, with the shock of realizing that something is wrong. She was not taken from her bed in her sleep, unaware of what was happening. She was conscious. She was alert. She experienced whatever unfolded in those 41 minutes. Why did she not call for help? Investigators believe the answer lies in the precision of the operation. This was not a chaotic break-in where noise and confusion might have created an opening. This was an execution of a plan by someone who knew the layout of that home, who knew where her communications were, who moved quickly enough and strategically enough to prevent her from using them. The pacemaker data, combined with the new footage analysis suggesting possible multiple approaches and reconnaissance, paints a picture of someone who had rehearsed this. Someone who had thought through the problems and prepared solutions before they ever set foot on that property for the final time. The ransom notes that have arrived at media outlets throughout the course of this investigation complicate everything further, and the new footage analysis brings them back into sharp relevance. Because if the footage is being re-examined, if the timeline is being reassessed, then the ransom communications must be reassessed alongside it. The first notes demanded millions of dollars in cryptocurrency and contained references to specific details about Nancy Guthrie's property, her floodlights, her Apple Watch, the consequences of her missing her medication, that only someone with genuine knowledge of her home and her routines could have included. The FBI confirmed that the notes mentioned specific features of the property, while declining to elaborate on what those features were. A second note shifted tactics, demanding payment not for Nancy's release but for information about who had taken her. A third note then appeared, demanding 1 Bitcoin in exchange for the identity of the person responsible. Each communication arriving like a chapter in a story that no one can yet read to the end. At least one of these notes was a fraud. Derek Kella, a 42-year-old man from Hawthorne, California, was charged with intent to transmit a ransom demand and using a telecommunications device to abuse, threaten, or harass after investigators traced his messages back to his Gmail account and determined the calls were made from his California home. He made his first court appearance and was released on bond, another subplot in a case already overflowing with them. But the existence of a confirmed fraud makes every other communication harder to evaluate. Investigators must now treat every note, every demand, every claimed piece of information as potentially false until proven otherwise. They must find signal in a noise field that gets louder with every passing day. The reward structure that has grown around this investigation reflects the urgency that everyone involved feels. The FBI initially offered $50,000 for information leading to Nancy's location and the arrest of whoever was responsible. That figure was later doubled to $100,000. An additional amount was added through a Crime Stoppers program. And then Savannah Guthrie, Nancy's daughter and one of the most recognized faces in American broadcasting, added $1 million of her own money to the reward total. $1 million. From a daughter who has continued to make public appeals with a composure that is difficult to watch, because behind the carefully measured words you can hear everything that cannot be said. "We still believe," Savannah said in a video posted on a Sunday 2 weeks after her mother's disappearance. "I wanted to say to whoever has her or knows where she is that it's never too late." The directness of that appeal is the directness of someone who has run out of options other than honesty. The tips that have poured in, nearly 40,000 by the most recent count, a 54% increase over comparable periods in previous investigations, represent an enormous public response that has generated enormous work. Each one must be evaluated. Each one must be checked against the known facts of the case, against the verified timeline, against the evidence that investigators hold but have not released. Retired FBI agent Lance Lissing offered a perspective worth sitting with. The public is likely aware of approximately 5% of what investigators actually know. 95% remains hidden, either to protect the investigation or to preserve evidence that will eventually be needed in court. So what does the new footage really show? That is the question we started with, and after everything we have examined, it deserves a direct answer. It shows a suspect who is methodical. Someone who does not move with the randomness of an opportunistic criminal but with the deliberateness of someone executing a plan. It shows a person who understood enough about surveillance technology to attempt to defeat it, but not enough to understand how deeply modern cloud systems preserve what we think has been erased. It shows, potentially, someone who came to that property more than once, who assessed and withdrew and returned, a behavioral pattern that speaks to patience and discipline that are unsettling in this context. It shows someone wearing gloves, carrying a backpack, and armed with what appears to be a handgun. It shows someone of average height and average build, descriptors that are accurate but that apply to an enormous percentage of the population. It shows someone whose face remains hidden, whose identity remains unknown, and whose DNA, while recovered, has yet to produce a match in any system investigators have access to through standard channels. What the footage does not show is equally important. It does not show a face. It does not show a vehicle. It does not show the full approach to the property. It does not show what happened inside the home during those 41 minutes. It does not show where Nancy Guthrie was taken. It does not answer the question that has haunted this investigation from the very beginning. Where is she now? The path forward that investigators are currently pursuing runs through investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that has transformed cold cases across the country over the past decade. Unlike CODIS, which contains DNA only from individuals who have been arrested or convicted, consumer ancestry databases contain genetic profiles from millions of ordinary people who submitted samples to learn about their heritage. By comparing an unknown DNA profile against these databases, investigators can identify relatives of the unknown individual, build partial family trees, and narrow a search down to a specific person even when that person has never had any contact with the criminal justice system. It is methodical work. It is time-consuming work. It can take weeks or months, but it has solved cases that had been cold for 30 years. It has put names to unknown profiles when every other avenue had been exhausted. The unknown male profile from the glove, and separately the unknown DNA from inside Nancy's home, are now the most important pieces of evidence in this investigation. Everything else, the footage, the backpack, the timeline, the ransom notes, points toward an identity that only the genetic material can confirm. There is a detail that keeps surfacing in the analysis of the new footage, and it is one that Sheriff Chris Nanos himself flagged as potentially significant. In the video, the suspect appears to be wearing a ring beneath his black gloves. A ring worn under the protective material, visible only because of the way the glove fits around it. It is a small detail, but small details are the currency of investigations like this one. A ring is personal. A ring is often unique. A ring can be a wedding band, a class ring, a family heirloom. If that ring can be identified, if someone watching this footage recognizes it, it becomes a thread that connects the masked figure to a real person with a real name and a real history. It is the kind of detail that the people who knew this suspect would recognize. And that is precisely why investigators are still asking the public to look, to think, to reach back into their memories and consider whether they know someone who matches this description. A male, 5'9" to 5'10", average build, who owns a dark Ozark Trail backpack, who may have been in southern Arizona in late January and early February, who wears a ring, who has no criminal record, or at least no record that would put his DNA in a national database, who is somewhere right now, waiting to see what investigators will do next.